Okay, thank you. Welcome to the Vermont Climate Council Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting on July 9th. Welcome everybody. In terms of members on the line, we have myself and Catherine, Secretary Curley, Jens Hilke, Jay Schaefer, and Karen Horn's on here, David Snedeker. Hi, everybody. So let's do a quick review of the agenda. It'll come as no surprise that most of our time today is going to be discussing tasks 4 and 5 for the climate action plan recommendations. And I think they're pretty hefty, so I think we're going to have a lot of discussion. So why don't we, that's primarily what we're looking at. I want to point out that next week we are going to be meeting in person. We'll have a video and audio option. We're still working out with Marion. She offered some space because I don't have a video option in the EOC yet. Working on it, but not there yet. So we will have both available, but because we're going to be really focusing on really rolling up all of the strategies that we've been talking about, finalizing some of them and rolling them up into the buckets or pathways for the presentation to the Vermont Climate Council. I very highly encourage everybody to be there in person when we let you know where the location is. That way we can do some group work, write on paper, do all the things that we used to always do in person, and really hammer out the overarching pathways that we want to come from the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. So we will get that information out about the location soon. Okay, are there any additions to the agenda that are needed today? And the minutes for our last meeting are also linked in the agenda. And I see we have a question from Ian Hitchcock. Yes, I think we will still have a Zoom component, right, Marion? Yep, she's nodding.
Yes, we will.
Okie dokie. Any other questions about the agenda? Okay, do we have any guests today? Anybody that is attending as a guest that doesn't normally attend? All the names on here look familiar, so we may be able to skip that part. Okay, why don't we go to subcommittee liaison and member updates? So subcommittee liaisons, and I'm going to start with Jay this time for Science and Data Subcommittee. What are Science and Data doing?
Hey everyone, can you hear me okay? Great. So we spent a fair amount of time getting Dr. Jillian Gelfert's report out from the Vermont Climate Assessment and information that's forthcoming with that. And that provided a lot of fertile discussion around understanding climate change in Vermont and talking about hazards as well and how it affects mitigation, and especially looking at trying to tease out some of the asynchronous effects around forest and forest health, and how that might affect things like carbon budgets and sequestration. That was a big part of the conversation. And I also have presented work in the last few weeks, some of the research that I've done, and I just, as a note on this, worked on a report with the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation on how climate change might affect insurance rates. That was pushed out in the last week or two, so there could be some results from that might help. One of the big concerns in areas has been the private sector and trying to get data from the private sector, and there's some places there that might help understand some of the risks. That was most of the meat of that conversation. I had to leave a little bit early towards the end. I think Marianne was on that call. I just want to pause there to see if she has anything else to fill in terms of substance.
Sorry, I'm half eating my lunch, so I have my camera off. No, Jay, I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay.
Jay, that was great work on that report on the insurance rates, and I'm glad that DFR did that because I think it verified what we already kind of knew, but it verified it in a very scientific way. So thank you. And I don't think we have Chad on today. Okay. Are there,
both Chad and Mike are out on vacation, I believe.
And we also, Joe is out as well. Are there any other pertinent updates from members or staff? Alrighty, we're gonna cruise right through. Catherine, did you have anything that you wanted to update folks on?
No updates, just letting folks know that if you didn't see it in your inbox yet, I did send out 2 pieces of information for you to take a look at that I think will be really helpful to our work in the next 2 weeks.
Great, and I see that Chad Farrell just signed on. I'm just going to give him a minute in case you want to. It's good timing because we were just doing subcommittee liaison updates.
All right, sorry for being almost 10 minutes late here. Yeah, so cross-sector mitigation met, yesterday. Very similar to what we're doing, running through the tasks and starting to populate the form, the spreadsheet form or the table form to begin getting all the recommendations lined up. Yeah, I don't know, Marion, you were on yesterday. Did I miss anything? I haven't had a chance to pull up the agenda here from yesterday. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
For cross sector?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think generally they had a really good discussion about their pathways. They're actually using slightly different terminology and we're trying to get them to shift to the terminology that we're using, but they have pathways, methods, and strategies. And I think their methods are really what we think of when we think of strategies. So they presented those and sort of talked through those. I also gave a presentation similar, kind of a longer version of what I gave you all last week around the template that we'll be asking subcommittees to use to present to the Climate Council at the end of July. And they had some great feedback on that, given that they've really done a lot of work around their pathways and strategies and how to represent that data. So that was a really good conversation.
Yep. Yeah, I've got the agenda up here. I think between you and I think we just covered pretty much everything. So.
Okay, thank you both.
Sure.
Are there, just last call for any other updates from members before we launch into our first substantial agenda item? Okay, great. So I'm going to hand it over. I think I'm handing it over to Stephanie Smith to begin our discussion about tasks 4 and 5, which is a reminder, is to develop recommendations for fortifying other critical community infrastructure, as well as developing recommendations to expand the use of nature-based solutions to enhance landscape resilience in the built environment. So for task 4, the work group was Ben Rose, Marion, and Stephanie, and I joined them on that. And on task 5 was Jen Silke, Ben Rose, Marion, and Stephanie. And some of these are overlapping, but I'll let Stephanie get into that. Take it away.
All right, the screen changed. I had to find my mute button. Yeah, thanks, Erica. So that was my first note was going to be, when we met to talk about this, there's a lot of overlap between task 4 and task 5. So we separated them out into the pathways a little bit. We were starting to think about what those buckets of different actions were already. So you'll see when we look at them that there are definitely recommendations within those buckets that could go under the opposite category, but we didn't want to silo it between the two. So there's definitely overlap. You'll see as we go through them that there's there's a decent amount of that in crossover. So for the sake of not siloing, we didn't specifically make sure it fell into one category or the other. And just as a reminder of where this task sits compared to the others. So this is the other critical infrastructure category. So last week we talked about energy and transportation. So that's not addressed here because those were addressed separately. And we wanted to start today with really having a better detailed conversation about what we mean when we're saying critical community infrastructure. And Ben and I had an initial conversation about that before we started getting into this process and talking about the tasks. And for, I think my perspective was really that we're talking about small towns in Vermont. So what's critical to those communities? And in addition to the transportation and energy, what Ben highlighted in a way that made a lot of sense to me is really the other pieces, which are water and wastewater, is another huge category of what's really important in small towns in Vermont. And then those community services, community facilities, that level of things. But we wanted to start, and I'll hand it back to Erica for this one, having that conversation. So we had a presentation from Matt on the Homeland Security side about what the definition of critical infrastructure was. We didn't specifically come to an agreement as a group on how we wanted to move forward, but I'll let Erica take this one.
Yeah, thank you. Marion made the very good point that when we are doing our engagement work around these recommendations, the question will come up, how did the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee land on a definition for what is critical community infrastructure? And just as a reminder, when we look at our charge, this all relates back to developing best practice recommendations specific to rural communities for reducing, sorry, I'm on the wrong one. Yeah, so for fortifying critical transportation, electricity, and community infrastructure. So we split out our recommendations related to transportation and energy, and from other community infrastructure. And there's no definition about what community infrastructure is. So we really as a subcommittee need to land in consensus around what is community infrastructure. In the emergency management and Homeland Security world, we talk about critical infrastructure, and the main reason for that is that if you have interruptions in any one of these 16 critical infrastructure sectors, you have critical interruptions to daily life and society, and you have potentially cascading effects into some of the other sectors. So when we look at this, just as a reminder, when we look at these critical infrastructure sectors, the lifeline sectors, which are really like the baseline lifeblood of all of the sectors, are transportation, communications, energy, and water. In our discussion around critical infrastructure, Jens made the very good point about how we want to incorporate green infrastructure or infrastructure that supports or mitigates the effects of cascading impacts down the line, especially as it relates to natural hazards. So that's like number one item that we need to have a discussion about today, and whether we as a subcommittee agree to define critical infrastructure or community infrastructure, two different terms, with this definition that's in front of us, or whether we want to edit that to allow for the definition to speak more to community infrastructure. We don't have to have that discussion right this yet. We'll do the presentation first, but as we work through that, think about that, and if we need to, we can get back to the definition and do an edit on that. Again, it's going to be really critical when we're doing engagement, because that will be I think that'll be a central question that folks will ask. Back to you, Stephanie.
And I'm going to hand it right to Ben, who has something to add.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Just following up on that, we had some really rich discussion around the different understandings of critical infrastructure and the pros and cons of going broad or staying focused on infrastructure. And as Stephanie said, we've got transportation, electric, and communications covered separately and specifically. And so you add to that water, wastewater, libraries, town halls, emergency operations centers, schools, and you've got the things that most community members think of as the nuts and bolts. But then, of course, those communities only exist in the ecological context of having functioning waterways and forests and so forth. And to Jens's point, the infrastructure includes the natural environment, but that's again covered by other working groups. So there's that overlap. The point that I want to make is that thus far, we have not had a lot of input from all the people on this working group are state employees. And we recognize that this is a starting line for a broader conversation that's more inclusive. And if we take the very narrow definition of community, it's important to acknowledge that there are pieces of critical infrastructure that are not covered, and in fact, it may not even be the primary purview of state government. There's an opportunity here to make a political point that is going to be well received when this thing gets discussed publicly and eventually deliberated on in the legislature, which is that not everything that's critical to a community begins and ends with state government initiative. There are pieces of social infrastructure and community fabric which are inherent to sustainable rural communities. And it is not necessarily going to be our task to make those things happen, but rather to just ensure that the physical conditions are retained, which enable communities to solve those problems and provide those functions. So there's an opportunity to say to everybody, this is not an attempt to do everything for everybody. This is an attempt to identify the critical things that are within the purview of state government to sustain the future work of local communities. It's a subtle point, but there's an opportunity here to put a spin on this, which is going to win us some points.
I'm confused by what you just laid out, Ben. I'm wondering why there's even the presumption that the critical infrastructure has to be under the purview of state government. And it doesn't seem to me like we would be saying something radical to suggest that critical community infrastructure goes beyond that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the federal infrastructure bill right now, it includes childcare, it includes a lot of things, and there's a lot of debate about what should be in and what should not. And there are going to be people saying that we're defining infrastructure too narrowly. But anyway, it's just something to be sensitive about in terms of how we present our discussion of critical infrastructure. And having raised it, I think we can move on. It's not something we have to solve right now.
No, well, but we do need to have more conversation about this at the end of the presentation, because we are, we as a group need to come to consensus about how we want to define critical community infrastructure. Why don't we move ahead with Stephanie's portion of this?
Okay. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Ben. So given the timeline here, my initial take of this in terms of coming up with these recommendations without the ability to really engage other entities before doing that process, it made a lot of sense to start with what we did within the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan, where these actions were developed with a significant group of stakeholders from across the state that were state government or outside of that. So this is a rough first take of what we're considering under this task. That starts with what we developed during that process as a launching point. So I think the buckets, we bucketed them into pathways to try and help make sense of what fit where and what we were talking about. But the recommendations that we're including in here are predominantly things that were already developed as a part of that 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. And Ben, you jump in whenever you want to. If I see you on mute, I'll call on you, but if you have thoughts or things to add, don't be shy. So one of the highest priorities identified, one of the top 3 or 4 things to come out of the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan was this idea that we needed to develop a statewide conservation and buyout program. So there were a couple of different pieces of that to speak to how we fund mitigation in the state. So one of those pieces is utilizing our existing funding sources to the best of their potential, which is anything under the hazard mitigation grant program, or even when we have public assistance dollars in the state and we can do mitigation that way, utilizing that to the fullest. But then really this first bullet became the priority around creating a dedicated state fund to support the local match of properties being one of those key pieces. So when we have FEMA dollars in the state, there's a 25% match requirement for hazard mitigation. So one key piece of that puzzle is figuring out a way to cover that 25% match. Another piece, the second bullet here, was around working with the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board on that program. They have had funding in the past to help us do projects that we weren't able to do with FEMA funding, and also to provide that match. So that's one piece of this puzzle as we build a full picture funding solution under hazard mitigation. For those who aren't familiar with ERAF, sorry about the acronym. One of the other ideas from this that came out from these conversations was to fund the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, which is currently an incentive program that we use to fund part of the state share for communities when we have public assistance dollars in the state. So the idea here is that we could expand that fund. It was one of the possible solutions for funding to go towards the mitigation program. Currently, it's only used on the public assistance side, but it's one idea. Yeah, Ben, I see you unmuted.
Yep, thank you. It works. I will just chime in on this one that we also had a working group coming out of the state hazard mitigation plan process to look at a new iteration of ERAF, and they were just starting to touch on some of the equity considerations that we've also mentioned in this committee. And we recognize that ERAF, as it's currently formulated, is kind of a blunt instrument and may have some unintended consequences in terms of making it difficult for small and under-resourced communities to check the incentive boxes. So it inadvertently becomes a sort of cross subsidy from the have-not communities to the have communities that have professional planners and can check all the boxes more easily. And so the real underlying objective of this was to come up with that non-federal match source. And we thought ERAF was an existing tool, but throwing in ERAF as a solution may be getting ahead of ourselves in terms of thinking about how ERAF should work in the future. So that one's a little bit dated, I guess.
All right, and I'll go through a couple more here, but if people have questions, raise your hand. Hopefully you pop up and I can see you. So another idea that we had is to figure out a way to track tax sale and foreclosed properties that are at flood risk within the state. We currently don't have a mechanism to do that. So properties will go to sale and we could have done buyouts on those and we've missed that opportunity. So that's another area that it would be helpful to have that more detailed background information. This is another one where more information up front to help us identify the properties in the state that should be our priority based on where we've had damages in the past, where we're anticipating future damages as well. And then the last one here before I get to the Flood Resilient Communities Fund is that one of the identified gaps for us as a state within applying for FEMA hazard mitigation funding is that there's a requirement that we have a benefit cost analysis, which is a specific FEMA program to show that the benefits are outweighing the cost of a particular project. And we have a really hard time fitting our erosion hazards into that tool. So doing buyouts in the river corridor is a challenge in the state. And it's been a goal of ours to figure out how to work around that benefit cost analysis tool to really get to be able to do the projects that we need to be able to do in the state, mainly buyouts in the river corridor with hazard mitigation assistance dollars. And then the last piece I added on here, which is really a solution to some of these initial elements that I've discussed already, is the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. So that's a tentative name. Not all this has to be approved before we go much farther, but this is the funding that we received from the American Rescue Plan Act, which we've discussed a little bit in this group, but we're currently developing this program. The hope is that we'll be able to use it as a match source. We were waiting on confirmation whether that's going to be possible, but this is really a fund to help us do some of those projects where we have gaps, where we're not able to use hazard mitigation assistance dollars, and the focus of that being buyouts. Yeah, Catherine.
Thanks. This is a great list to start. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the recommendations here. Is the second bullet is to enable buyouts for homes that perhaps haven't been damaged yet, but we fully expect will be, whether they're in the map flood hazard area or not, they just need to be vulnerable.
Yes.
Am I getting that right? Okay, that's great. So we don't have to wait.
And that's also
damaged.
how we're talking about the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, is the same sort of proactive doing projects in the river corridor before it's a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I think, so based on that, I think it would be really helpful for both the second bullet and the BCA bullet to talk about how we can incorporate environmental justice and equity considerations in that analysis and not just simply do the numbers game, because I think we've all seen what happens as a result of that. And I think it would be good for us to be explicit in our recommendations about that. And then the final comment I would have is how, if at all, can we, there's more of a question, how can we or should we recommend funding to help people actually find a place to live if we buy them out? Because that is also one of our existing challenges.
Yeah, and that's a piece that we're within the development of this new program that we're trying to figure out. It's a nut that we're trying to figure out how to crack, which is really that in order to have a full program, we can't just say we bought this house and now the project is done. We need to figure out where people are going to go, and so we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do that. I think it needs a case management approach at the housing level to say where these people are going to go, how can we support them in that, and make sure that we're not just taking away additional housing in Vermont, but there are places for people to go. So we don't have an answer for that, but it's definitely part of the conversation at this point.
Maybe the wording around that is, to explore different ways to do all of those things, rather than, we don't have to solve the problem and then put it in the climate action plan. It's just maybe bringing the resources together to solve the problem in a recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's a good approach to acknowledge the issue and know it has to be solved.
Yeah. Marion's got her hand up.
Thanks, Erica. And I was going to actually build off or kind of note your point as well, that this is the opportunity for recommendations around specific programs or ideas that we don't have all of the answers to yet, and to put those into the draft recommendations that go to the Climate Council. I think thinking about that and all of the recommendations that are on this slide and taking a step back to think, is there a way to have a pathway that is more broad than just talking about one specific program, that's really looking at what are we trying to work towards when we think about adaptation and actually moving folks out of the floodplain, right? Like, is there a larger sort of broader pathway where multiple strategies could fit underneath that? One of which would be development of state conservation and buyout program. Because I think when I think of that, it's a specific program. And to me, that's a strategy. So I think just something to think about, and we can mull over that throughout the presentation.
I think that's great. Thanks, Marion. Ben?
Yeah, all the points that Catherine and Marion have raised are good ones and have been discussed by the working group, which includes people from Agency of Natural Resources too, that's starting to build out the Flood Resilient Communities program. And we're going to be meeting with the State Hazard Mitigation Selection Review Committee next week to start working on the evaluation criteria for the first round of projects that we would do with year one funding for the program, which would be sort of a demonstration, and we'll have to learn as we go. But we're looking, for example, at how we could incorporate the equity considerations into the evaluation criteria for specific buyouts. The thought of the second bullet, Catherine, when it was framed in the plan, was to broaden the ability to do buyouts to structures that are not in the special flood hazard area FEMA mapped, but we know they're in the river corridors that our river engineers tell us are flood vulnerable. So it was basically just broadening our definition of what the flood zone is. But FEMA has some rules around the cost of structures that are automatically considered to be cost effective within their zone. And likewise, we can develop rules that weight favorably projects that are below a certain value of home, for example. Yeah, that's so basically we can do a lot of those things in the details of the program design. We're also, another thought was to expand the state program to cover parcels that are not developed yet. You know, FEMA, they'll only buy out the risk on a structure that already exists, whereas we see opportunities to buy parcels before there's a flood-prone structure on them, and that has co-benefits. And lastly, on the second point, Catherine, the FEMA existing rules allow for the buyout of a structure that has never been flooded before, simply because it is in that special flood hazard area. So there's not a requirement now that a structure has already been flooded if we know it's in a dangerous place and meets the FEMA criteria. Likewise, with the state program, we don't anticipate that there'd be any requirement that the flood has already happened. We're trying to get out ahead of it.
I think it would be worth at some point having a more detailed conversation with this group about, we're sort of getting at some of what we're thinking about in terms of this new program, but I think it's worth having a bit of a brain trust here as well in terms of how that gets developed and how we're considering it. So maybe at some point we'll have time for that.
And sorry, one more point, which is that we've also started the conversations with the folks who are working on housing programs that are ARPA funded, and there's a shared desire to break down the silo between buying out flood-prone homes and figuring out where people are going to live. You know, we know that there's a housing gap right now in Vermont of somewhere, depending on who we're talking to, between 50 and 100,000 units. And so if we're adding another 10,000 units or whatever that are in flood-prone locations now, we're just part of a much bigger housing problem, and it's not enough under current market conditions to buy someone out of a flood-prone location unless we're also helping figure out where they're going to go. We know that.
All right. Any other thoughts or comments on this one before we jump down? All right. Then Another area which falls somewhat within this conservation and buyout bucket, but also might really fit better under task 5 or maybe even within the agriculture and ecosystems working group, is a group of suggestions that we received from the Conservation Law Foundation to include. And actually, I saw Dale on here if she wants to speak to these, because I'm sure you can speak to them much more eloquently than I can, if you're interested, although I don't want to throw you completely under the bus here.
Thanks, Stephanie. And I will say, Zach Porter is probably a much better person to talk about these recommendations than I am. But, you know, I think that these recommendations fit really well with what everyone was just talking about. Instead of, you know, having things be built in vulnerable places, let's strengthen our wetlands so that there are fewer vulnerable places. Let's make sure that there's not new work being installed in the wetlands that's going to be at risk. And let's use those wetlands as flood attenuation zones and habitat zones to protect everything that's neighboring and downstream. That's the short and simple version of this. And I think it does fit in really well with the buyout ideas and gets at the same problem from a different side.
Thank you, Dale.
And for more detail, I will be happy to connect anybody to Zach. He just wasn't available this afternoon.
All right. Then another bucket that we talked about is around land use and building codes. So again, what I have here is not anything new other than what we developed underneath the 2018 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. When we get down to Jens and his slides, that's where there's another category, and this is what I was saying about the overlap between the two. This is another category that really comes up there as well. And some of our ideas that are beyond what we've included here, he'll speak to those later. But the two high-level ideas here, we're really trying to figure out mechanisms for locating our new development outside of areas that are hazardous. Jens will speak to that a little bit more in terms of having a state land use plan and those higher level ideas about how we can actually achieve that piece of things, so that we're locating things outside of harm's way, and finding ways to do that. And then the other piece is really around design and construction. So the other caveat that I'll put on this second list here is that one of the issues that we ran into with the new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program is that there's a significant highlight on having building codes within the competitive criteria. And I think it's worth this group deciding whether it's important for the state of Vermont to have a residential building code, recognizing that that would be a huge political lift. I think it's worth the conversation at some point as to whether that's actually something we would want to do. I don't know if brick is enough of a reason to push us in that direction, but it's definitely, if they don't change the competitive criteria after this year, it's going to be very hard for states like Vermont to get any competitive funding in future years. So it's at least something to consider.
Any reactions to Stephanie's question there? Is having a statewide building code something we ought to put on as a recommendation for discussion? Not that we have to say we're endorsing it. Is it worth putting on for a recommendation for discussion? Any thoughts?
It's a big thing, and I think the lift would be substantial, which that would be my concern, but
doesn't mean it's not worth doing.
Yeah. Karen, you unmuted?
That would be very difficult for us to support, just saying.
Can you expand on that, or Karen and then Chad?
Thanks. Yeah.
Well, I suppose you could have a statewide building code like we have the building energy standards now if the funding and staff accompanied it so that it was enforced at the state level. but not passed on to local governments to enforce.
I hear your point, and that seems like an important thing to note if we're going to put this on as a strategy. Chad?
Yeah, I may have missed it, but are there other states where this is where they've done something like that, where they have a statewide building codes? I mean, I think of California immediately, but I'm just this is not an area of expertise for me. I'm just curious, is there precedent out there in other jurisdictions?
Oh yes, there are a lot of states that have the fact that Vermont doesn't have a building code is more unique. A residential building code. But there are certainly a number of states that didn't meet that requirement under BRIC. That even like states like Texas, who submitted a significant number of competitive applications and didn't get any funding.
So just to clarify, there are building codes that have been adopted by the state for like health and safety standards, and but they're not administered by anybody unless the town decides to take them on. And S79 is kind of an instructive example right now in terms of what's possible around those kinds of building codes.
Yeah,
But I'm not saying that we should be limited by what's possible, but
nationally, building codes have been a very big emphasis for FEMA, because if you look at the national hazard assessment, wildfires and urban wilderness, boundaries are one place where building codes really matter for new construction. Likewise, for tornado vulnerable states, having homes that don't turn into flying sticks is important. And what's the third one? Earthquake zones. If you're building skyscrapers that don't survive a likely quake in a seismically active area. So for all three of those reasons, buying down federal risk is really hinged to building codes. And it may be that none of those hazards are drivers in Vermont. And so a state building code might not be as painful or onerous on homesteaders as we imagine.
So based on that conversation, I'm going to suggest, Stephanie, that you draft something that you could put in here as a recommendation, because we're going to see this again. And that includes Karen's concerns about the necessity of it not being an unfunded local mandate, and see what you can come up with that we could react to when we review it as our final review.
Okay.
Does anybody object to that approach?
no, I think that's good. This is Karen again. I have been kind of thinking about that housing issue altogether, and maybe a way to approach it is by having standards, so not to get diverted after my long absence, for which I apologize, everybody, but
We're happy to have you. We're happy to have you.
It seems more and more evident that all our designated areas are not going to be able to meet the demand for the 50 to 100,000 units that of housing that the state needs in theory. And so maybe what we recommend doing is developing standards for building potentially beyond those areas or outside those areas that that meet all the concerns we have around climate change and building in the forest and all those kinds of things. But I think it just seems more and more evident to me that if we just stick with the old construct we've had of everything being encouraged to go into those designated areas, in this new world we're in, it's not going to work. People are going to build other places anyway.
Thanks, Karen. And you saw Jay's point too, Stephanie?
Yes, I did. Thanks, Jay.
So 2 additional things to consider.
Mhm. All right. Chris, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add just a point of clarification for Karen. I encourage you to read through those ideas. I think there is a need to evaluate the state designation programs and look at larger areas, recognizing the point you make. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Okay, so more to come on building codes. Any other thoughts before I move on? Okay. And then the last piece, there were really 2 other categories that we were looking at, one around improving vulnerable structures and critical infrastructure. And then we've addressed dam resilience here as well. That was one of the 16 categories at the top. So we've put that in here. I think it's worth exploring how we organize this in a way that maybe makes a little more sense, but this is the starting point here. So on the left, identifying and protecting vulnerable structures and critical infrastructure, a couple of ideas here that we pulled from the state plan around requiring consideration of river corridors in the state permitting process. This was specific to water and wastewater. We had some conversations in our group around how this might be on your slide too, Jens, with the state land use plan, but how we incorporate that more broadly, the river corridor standards across the state at the state level. Providing technical assistance to municipalities to assess their flood and erosion risk around wastewater and water systems. And then the last piece here, a bit of a separate conversation around retrofitting and removing risk to mobile home parks. And it's possible that fits better under the buyout cap now that I'm thinking about it. So the buyout and conservation piece may be a better fit for that if we update that title a little bit. But that's the first set. Thoughts on that before I jump to dams? All right. And then on the dam removal side, the couple of strategies that we'd come up with were around making sure we had the right information for dams, so digitizing all those map layers, inventorying and having the contact information, emergency plans for existing dams, and improving security of high hazard dams. And then lastly, making sure that we were updating the dam inventory, supporting dam removal in the state. And I think that could be broadened as well to the language that's here. Other thoughts on that or other pieces of infrastructure that we should be addressing here from what we talked about as critical at the top and things that we're missing in this assessment? I heard housing come up at some point, which that's worth a conversation.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing here is a lot of, the state hazard mitigation plan, and there's no, housing. We need housing. You need a place to stay. So I think that's a missing piece. And it's a little squishy, but, there's this whole, I know you're talking about things, but there's this kind of community infrastructure, your neighbors helping your neighbors, and I think is a missing piece here. It's hard to quantify and hard to measure, but, it's what holds Vermont together. It's your neighbors checking on your neighbors. And I think during disasters and events like that, that is an important thing. I don't know how you build it. I don't know how you measure it, but I think we certainly need to acknowledge it.
What do folks think about those 2 points that have been brought up a few different times, somehow including housing and also this social infrastructure, whether it's childcare or senior facilities or just the local governance or neighbor helping neighbor? What do people think about those 2 items being included in critical community infrastructure?
So
Got a thumbs up from Chad.
On the more social fabric side of things, what I struggle with is the fact that we really need to prioritize our recommendations in the climate action plan to the solutions that are going to get the biggest bang for the buck and are going to have the most impact on rural resilience. And for me, that's infrastructure, not in terms of prioritization. It is not to say that the very important elements of our communities that really make Vermont Vermont and make Vermont communities very resilient aren't important. But if we are going to break the cycle of disaster and break the, stop the effects that climate change has on the natural hazards and their impacts in our state, then we have to focus on hardening our infrastructure and doing all of the things that are outlined in these slides. That's just my opinion.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, you talk often about prioritizing these things, and I understand the need, but I don't see it in the act. So I think it's a lot of different strategies we have to consider when you're looking at how, what are we going to do in the next 50 years? So just another comment. Thanks.
Go ahead, Mary.
Go ahead, Allison, you can go first. Or someone. Okay, maybe not. So I think to Erica's point, I guess I want to touch base about prioritizing what this group focuses on, because I think there's been some discussion or there will be discussion and thought about how overall pathways and strategies specifically are prioritized at the Climate Council level. And I think there would be a real benefit to having this subcommittee put something out there about sort of social structure or social community that helps communities be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. I think that's, that's specifically identified in the charge in the Global Warming Solutions Act, and to miss that, doesn't allow the Climate Council to weigh into that and to provide feedback on that, even though, there may be from this group a stronger preference for the critical infrastructure, community critical infrastructure piece. I think we would be missing something if we didn't have some focus on the social piece. And I think the same could be said for housing as well, especially because, again, housing is called out in the charge of this subcommittee in the act. And so there certainly needs to be, I think, some separate pathways around housing and what that means in the face of climate change.
Other thoughts?
So Marianne, does that look like a recommendation around, and maybe this is just for Marianne, this is for the whole group. Does that look like a recommendation to address that, those factors? Does that look like a recommendation around, supporting those elements that make up the social fabric of our communities? Or is it a recommendation around fortifying and resourcing the entities that are responsible for fortifying our infrastructure in our communities? We look at like the DRBs and the different zoning and all of those elements locally that have such an impact when you knit them together collectively on the resilience of our infrastructure and the community participation in those processes. I wonder if there is truly enough health. I think there's two ways to look at that. And again, it's a question for this group is the fabric of our communities in terms of the social constructs that support people, especially after disaster, but just on a day-to-day basis, really, as important, and we should be looking at ways to support that and constitute the need for a recommendation in the climate action plan.
I see also Dave put a note in the chat that he thought that recommendations around this seem beyond what the state or communities can really implement. So what I'm hearing is a difference of opinion in this point. And what I'm wondering is if we could take a similar approach to what we did with the building codes, which is that we could task this group with coming up with something that they could include in the next iteration that we see, and we can then react to it and see if we can come to some consensus, even if it's not a consensus that we all agree that it should be a priority, perhaps a consensus that we agree that we should be putting that out there in the public engagement part to seek feedback on it. So at least that's how I'm kind of approaching these. I may not agree with every strategy, but I agree that they should be thrown out there for reaction and comment and conversation. And so I'm wondering if we could take that approach with this question too and see some version of it in our next draft.
And Abby, I see your hand.
I don't know if it helps to know, Catherine, but I would just back you up on that has been the strategy that Ag and Eco has taken with this, that sort of like they talked about with CADMIS, that it's the responsibility of the task groups and the subcommittees to feed the full breadth of information and perspective up to the Climate Council in order for them to then decide what pieces they're going to pull into the climate action plan. And so I feel pretty strongly that whether there's political will to do something or not, whether there's the financial capacity or not, that we need to be as transparent as possible and put forward as many ideas as we can. And then, you know, if there isn't the political will, if they are something that we don't feel like is possible, that can be flagged at that point and be noted as such. But I think it's potentially problematic if not everything is being brought forward. So appreciate you bringing that up and just wanting to offer the perspective from another subcommittee.
Abby, while you're talking, you want to introduce yourself? I'm not sure everybody here knows who you are.
Hi. Abby Course, organic dairy farmer at the Course Farm Dairy. I'm the co-chair of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and the appointed Farm and Forest Sector representative to the Vermont Climate Council. Sorry, I'm only just popping in now. I've been meaning to attend more meetings and it just doesn't seem to work, but happy to be here today.
Thanks, Abby. Other thoughts from people? All right, task 5. Stephanie's moving on. Thank you, Stephanie.
We can still comment just to the next slide so you know that that was the last. And Jens, do you want to take control and cycle through them yourself? All right.
Well, while Jens is setting up, one thing that would be helpful is if a member of the committee could articulate the housing item with a verb. Like what is the thing or the pathway, or how would we frame the housing pathway around we need more housing?
Chris, could you or Jacob help feed into that?
Yeah, we'll work on that.
Thanks. I think you already have a start anyway.
Yep.
Certainly, if anybody else wants to volunteer too, since I volunteered somebody already for them. There's anybody else.
I was hoping Chris was going to agree.
Are folks seeing my screen, the task 5 PowerPoint? Great. Thank you. As Stephanie noted, there is a lot of overlap here in task 5 with some of the things we saw in task 4, particularly around the aquatic world. And there's also a lot of overlap here with ag and ecosystems. And so I have some slides from recommendations that I have from ag and ecosystems, just to show you what those recommendations look like and how we drafted these to fit into that context. but I couldn't help myself and just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page with respect to the broad charge of this group. And well, just a couple definitions, you know, that the definition of adaptation and resilience in the Act does really speak to the natural systems piece. And so those are built into the definitions and therefore into the charge of the group. You know, we've added this, I believe the Climate Council added nature-based solutions into the list that's at right. But, you know, these natural systems is really baked into this, even as we think about rural communities. And I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page with respect to the scale. So if we want to talk about nature-based solutions in the built environment, we're not just talking about rain gardens in downtown. We need to look at that larger landscape pattern to have enough land to actually use those nature-based solutions, and that will affect the downtowns. So what's on screen is the example from Hurricane Irene and the amount of water that Rutland received versus Middlebury. And the difference, you know, there was a massive spike of water in Rutland, not so much in Middlebury. The difference between those two communities, why they experience such different circumstances, is because of the intact floodplains and wetlands along Otter Creek between those two communities. So it's that whole landscape and the access of the river to the floodplains and wetlands that created that effect in the built environment of Middlebury. So it's a much larger area that these nature-based solutions are applied on. And really the same is true in the forest world, is that we need to look at this much larger pattern to then be able to realize the benefits of nature-based solutions in our built environment. So this is my street in Burlington, and trees are great. Trees in downtown environments do all sorts of things for us, but please know that there are exponentially more benefits in terms of climate and the benefits that we can realize in the built environment from forests outside of our communities. And so the benefits include access, you know, scenery, biological diversity, the opportunities for a working landscape and all the economic benefits that brings. Larger forest blocks are going to have more species. They're going to have more land for movement of animals. They're going to be able to reduce more water going into our built communities and lessen erosion. So I'm just trying to make this point, the distinction between trees and forest. Why this is such a big deal for me in my world is because usually we can measure tree cover. We don't do a particularly good job. We don't have a standard definition for measuring forest cover over time. So we talk about all these benefits of forest, but the metric that's usually used is trees, and those are different. And now that we have a higher quality LiDAR-based land cover data, we're beginning to get at some of those distinctions. But it's an important distinction for our work because we get so many more benefits from the larger patches of forest than we do from individual trees, even when in aggregate, those individual trees take up a lot of space. We haven't talked about Vermont conservation design in this group. And I wanted to make sure you all at least had seen it. This is the Agency of Natural Resources Design for a Resilient Future. We call it the Strategy to Protect, Enhance Ecological Function. So these are the lands and waters in Vermont that are most important to maintain that ecological function. That's not saying that we can't build anywhere in that darkest green. It means the darkest green are the places where we need to manage for ecological function. A whole range of human uses can occur in there when they're in the right place and when they're managed for ecological function. So this map, this design is critically important when we're thinking about nature-based solutions. We've done the work to figure out where those most important forests are. And now we need to come up with strategies that support this network. And it's not just a network of forests, it's a network of forests and waters and enduring features, literally the bedrock, and how those all interact. So I know I'm getting far afield from nature-based solutions in the built environment, but please understand that this network is what gives us those nature-based solutions in the built environment. This is that larger landscape that we need to call upon. So if we're trying to control pattern and forest pattern across the landscape, and we're trying to concentrate our trees into forests so we can maximize those benefits in our communities, well, how's that happening right now? Well, there are 266 separate municipalities in Vermont, and they all have separate land use planning and regulatory authority. Most of them choose to plan, but not all of them. I think 86% of them have some sort of zoning code, but we have no idea what that the composite, what that all looks like if we were to put it together. No one has put those 260, whatever it is, 86% of 266. No one has ever put those together on the same map because they're a bit of apples and oranges. So we really have no idea what the future of the Vermont landscape, what future we're planning for under the current system. And then 83% of that land is in private ownership. So I'm just trying to highlight this larger pattern, ecological pattern, and the challenges in the planning world that we're currently confronting. And so from my standpoint, what this lack of coordinated planning has given us is sprawl. We've embraced a sprawling landscape since World War II. This is Burlington to South Burlington down to Shelburne. And this is auto-dependent strip development. But sprawl looks more like this in most of Vermont, that sort of one house at a time development. The first house isn't a big deal. Maybe even the second house isn't a big deal. But somewhere along the line, the culmination of that impact is creating a sprawling landscape and is impacting our forests. And so that's the problem with nature-based solutions, is that incremental whittling away at the larger pattern. And what kind of tools do we have to maintain that forest pattern? These are a series of pictures from Stowe from 1962 to 2011. I'll cover forest for you in a second. Please know that the total number of trees doesn't change between, or the acreage of trees in these photos don't change between 62 and 2011. What changes is the pattern, and therefore the benefits that we can realize from this nature-based solution. So here we are in 62, 74, 80, 96, 2007, and 2011. Again, the total amount of green trees doesn't change, even as Vermont was 20% forest in 1880, and we rose up to about 80% forest by the 1970s, and now we're going down. So even at the same time as there's this massive reforestation and afforestation, this area doesn't realize any change in tree cover. What we realize is a loss of forest, of intact connected forest. Okay. Then lastly, in terms of regulation, I said there are 266 municipalities and 86% of them have zoning. On your left is Waitsfield, and it's has some of the better planning and regulatory framework of the towns in Vermont. But look at this. Here is their forest district, and they really do limit development above 1,600 feet. And you'll see that there are very few houses in that district. They also have a special flood hazard area there in purple. And so they do a pretty good job now of keeping new development out of that area. But everything here in the middle is all their rural residential 1. So there's very little ability to control forest pattern. they regulate inside the box of a particular parcel because it's all in that rural residential district. So the existing tools to limit sprawl, to encourage concentrated development, and to maintain that larger forest pattern are very difficult to achieve town by town. Right is Richmond, and I just wanted to highlight. Look, all of Richmond, almost all of Richmond, is their rural residential district, and so it's 1 acre zoning across the entire town. That is a recipe for sprawl. You cannot control forest pattern with that sort of zoning. And so the challenge with these 266 separate municipalities is getting any sort of larger pattern to stick from one town to the next. So I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page in terms of that bigger picture context of our charge here and some of the problems we're seeing in the real world. I'm just going to transition now. Here's the charge for one of the task groups for the Ag and Ecosystems Working Group. And I'm just showing you this quickly to show you the overlap. So that 5D charge was to improve adaptation of natural and working lands. And they came up, they have 5 pathways, but 3 of them are relevant to our work here. And I'll show you the specific strategies within their pathways, just so we can begin to ferret out what that working group is covering and the suggestions that we've come up with for this subcommittee. So they have this pathway of equitably expand incentives, technical assistance, funding, and research to empower landowners and managers to implement climate-friendly forestry. That's great, and there's some really good things in here that do promote that climate-friendly forestry. Please note that none of these actually control the pattern of where there's forest. These are great for maintaining tree cover, for maintaining a working landscape, but not for that larger pattern of connected forest. So that's sort of one place where I think we can add to this to really focus on pattern as an important constituent in our nature-based solutions. Another relevant pathway was develop and implement land use planning and regulations that incorporate climate change adaptation, resilience, and empowered community engagement. And so, they mention Vermont conservation design. They talk about increasing conserved lands and this 30 by 30 initiative. That's President Biden's 30% by 2030 land in permanent conservation. There's a statement here about develop and implement statewide zoning, which seems needs a bit of a finer point in my mind. And then there's achieve compact settlements through investment in water and wastewater. There's climate resilience zones. There's upgrading the Vermont wetland maps. So there's a lot here. But it doesn't really hit that forest pattern piece to my liking. So the suggestions that this group came up with, so the Ag and Ecosystems group have that orange header. This is our work. And I think to Marion's point earlier, we need to do some work to get the pathway broad enough to ensure we can incorporate multiple strategies. The ideas here are using Vermont conservation design to really focus in on the forests and waters in the design for this resilient and connected network. I will note that every stream and river in Vermont is included as highest priority within the design. So the aquatic network is well represented, and this network then uses that aquatic network and shows where the forests are connected through that aquatic network. Another idea here is to support investigation of new revenue sources to boost forest land conservation. In order, you'll see a slide a little bit later, but in order to achieve that 30 by 30 goal, we would need to add, I think, something in the range of 56,000 acres per year to permanent conservation. And so a new revenue source is needed to achieve that. This one about fund and support efforts to track the rate of forest fragmentation and parcelization. And we have some good tools for tracking parcelization, taking a big parcel and splitting it up into smaller and smaller bits. We don't have as good a tools for tracking fragmentation, how the forest gets smaller and smaller. And so this is getting into the weeds a bit about using a 30-meter pixel to track where our forest is and our development is. That's pretty coarse for Vermont. So this is saying use LiDAR to get a better sense of where we're fragmenting forests or where we have intact forests. Education efforts, this is related to the land trust community. And this is just saying, hey, as a land protection, as a group of land protection organizations, we need to come down off the hill. And instead of focusing on these islands of forest that are more removed from our communities, we need to be doing more protection closer to our communities to allow for this network of connected land. And then
what if we don't want to come down off the hill? Maybe we just
you don't need to, but we need the land trust to do more work. It's more expensive closer to the road. And it's harder to justify. You're going to have a longer list of ecological attributes if you're trying to conserve land in the middle of a forest in the Northeast Kingdom than you are on the side of Route 15 in Wolcott. And yet that side of Route 15 in Wolcott at this point is really important for the overall forest pattern. So we're trying to get them to not just work on islands of habitat, but really focus on a network of connected land.
As an aside, Jens, if I was just reading that, that's not how I read that bullet. So you may want to add some clarity there.
Thank you. Yeah, the language here was taken from the public comment recommendations from the Vermont Forest Partnership. But yes, I agree. And then this last one is about the implementation of the intergenerational transfer of forest land working group recommendations in 2016. So that's really about that transfer, that intergenerational transfer piece. So I have one more slide of forest pattern pathways that are more funding oriented, but let me just pause. What comments, questions, thoughts are coming up for people on this slide?
Yeah, Chris Cochran. Yeah, I think Vermont conservation design is something that you understand and maybe several other people do, but I think similar to Catherine's note, without some more context, I think it'd be hard for other people to know what you're getting at. So some elaboration there and how that leads to implementation and the protections that you were talking about.
Thanks, Chris. Just making room for others. All right. So this is an attempt at lumping some of the pattern, the funding ones together. And so here, provide funding for permanent conservation of 55,000 acres. That number, again, is just figuring out what 30% of the Vermont landscape is and how many acres we have now in permanently conserved land and what we need to do to get there each year between now and 2030. So that's why this 55,000 acre number is here. And here I said, within the VCD area. So again, it's not just trees or forest wherever, it's that highest priority intact forest that's within the network where we're going to realize the most benefit in our built communities. Fully fund VHCB each year, like happened this year. Support adequate funding for the ongoing maintenance and improvement of VCD. We update it every 3 to 4 years, but it is a question of political will each time we ask to do it. So this is just saying, can we get a little Yeah, can we get a little help here and make sure that this is going to happen each time we need it to? The technical assistance outreach programs, there's a whole list here, but this idea of successional planning, as we get to, I think it's a quarter of Vermonters are going to be 65 or older by 2030, I think is the number. We have an older population. So questions of how our older Vermonters split up their land, whether they sell an intact parcel or divide it among their children, is hugely important for the future of the forest. So this succession planning is really important to help landowners have those conversations with their kids, with the family, to figure out what to do with these forest land parcels moving forward. That's a huge issue that needs to be addressed. And then the Staying Connected initiative is a partnership, a collaborative that the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, Agency of Natural Resources, VTrans have been partners in since 2009. It's focused on habitat connectivity, again, this connected network of forests across the whole Northeast into Canada, really from the Adirondacks to the Maritimes. We coordinate at the Vermont level, but we also coordinate at the Northern Appalachians level. This is just saying, hey, it would be great if we could pay for membership in that organization to coordinate at that larger than the state level. So again, our efforts at a connected network aren't just within the state boundaries, they're part of this larger pattern across the entire Northern Appalachians. So let me pause. I know I'm throwing a ton of stuff at you, and I realize that there's a whole range of experiences in this group, and this may not be your day-to-day. So no question is off the table. Please feel free.
Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jens. This is, I can tell you put a lot of work into this, so it's really fantastic to see. Not, I guess, a specific question about what you've presented here, but I do, I guess, just want to put the reminder out that at this point in the process, we're, looking for pathways and draft strategies to be presented to the Climate Council. And I think a reminder that, especially when it comes to sort of actions, which I can see some of these are, where it's really asking, the who, what, when, where, the really specific actions that will get us to achieving our strategies and pathways. Those will be sort of co-created with the public in the public engagement process in the summer into the fall. And so just thinking about, pathway development and strategy development, and then the draft actions that go underneath, we should just keep an eye on the fact that, the intent is to really co-create these with the public as we move forward. So just wanted to put that reminder out there about the process.
So, Marian, so what I think I'm hearing from that is that when we get together next week and we're looking at grouping our strategies under pathway categories, we should also be looking at the strategies themselves to see if they're too specific or whether they should be a bit broader in their wording.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting taking anything off the table. I think all of, we're not trying to remove things, but I think, and I can share after this, we have some sort of definitions of like, what is a pathway, what is a strategy, what is an action? And yeah, I think it would be helpful, and I can provide some examples of, this is more of a strategy and fits under a pathway, and then this is an action because it has sort of specific, like identifies a specific program or a specific, project that should be created. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Chad?
Sure. Thank you. Jens, this is really fascinating, and obviously a big focus on forest, right? Connected forests, I think mainly as a carbon sink, right? And so I guess I'm just wondering, and maybe your presentation further on will address this, but what about other kind of land usage? I mean, we've got a lot of ag land, farmland, that's, either, hayed or corn is grown on it or soybeans or whatever. Are there other, so I think from my solar development hat on, you know, we're finishing all of our projects with pollinator-friendly ground cover. And in doing so, you know, we're learning that the carbon sequestration potential of a pollinator-friendly ground cover versus, you know, the business as usual case of you know, a hay meadow or corn or some other, you know, land-based crop, you know, is significant. So, I mean, are we going to be looking at other avenues of land use management beyond forestry, I guess, and or we really want to focus on forest because that's the biggest bang for the buck?
Yeah, Chad, thank you. Yes, I'm headed to a land use section next that will get at that larger pattern. But specifically, in my opinion, my professional opinion, we get so much benefit from forests that it's really the best place to start. And because we're talking about rural communities, that focus on forests seemed particularly appropriate to me. And so it's not just the greenhouse gas, the carbon sequestration function, but also related to flooding and disaster mitigation and the ability for those headwater forests, forests that include headwater streams to suck up that water before it becomes floodwater.
That's great. Thank you. And I think we should just keep track of, you know, at some point there, we're going to be able to monetize the carbon benefits of our land usage. You know, the Biden infrastructure plan, you know, specifically calls that out. We'll see where it all ends up. But, you know, so we're talking to landowners that we lease land from and say, hey, look, you're going to have a better land cover here. We're just leasing it for the solar. You get all those carbon benefits, but you know, you could essentially, in addition to the lease payment we're paying you, you'll be able to monetize additional carbon, benefits. You'll be able to monetize those. And I think that, you know, that's going to be the case for forestry or, you know, improved agricultural conditions, whatever it may be. So just sort of an FYI to make sure we keep our eyes on that as an incentive, I guess, to continue to help people, you know, understand the benefit of keeping their land in active forestry.
Yep, thank you. Others before I move on?
I just wanted to throw out two things. I don't want this to sound self-serving, but I think it would be also beneficial to fully fund the local and regional planning in addition to the Housing and Conservation Board, especially given what you highlighted earlier about the disparate ways in which our land uses are managed at the local level. And then, oh, great. Well, not just us, but the towns too. The towns need the money too. You're welcome, Karen. And then the other thing is back to the transfer of land. I would love to see us put something in here when we talk about succession planning that isn't business as usual, but make sure we take every advantage to work to address some of the inequities of land ownership that have been exacerbated through state, federal, and local decision making. And if we're going to be putting money and effort toward technical assistance for succession planning, let's make sure we tackle some of those inequities while we're at it.
Thank you, Catherine. I got that note. And yeah, just to jump up and down about your last point, you know, the municipalities and the regional planning commissions are what's keeping this whole system together, in my humble opinion. And we absolutely have to increase the funding for both regional planning commissions and towns in order to hold this together. There's a massive rift between statewide laws and what happens at the local level. And most of the control of pattern gets lost in that chasm between the two. And so you know, the local capacity piece is critically important for being able to do any of these strategies at the municipal level, in my opinion. So I can't say enough about supporting municipalities and the regional planning commissions. Particularly, I'd like to include a recommendation of having a natural resource staff planner at each regional planning commission. a system similar to the TPI, the Transportation Planning Initiative, where there is the Agency of Natural Resources would pay for those planners. Those planners would be RPC staff and totally independent of the agency, but would then be responsible for certain deliverables and would all get together each month like the TPI does. So there's this constant feedback between ANR and the regional planning commissions. And that's critically important because the regional planning commissions are the premier deliverer of technical assistance to the municipalities. And so anything we can do to strengthen that chain of communication from what are these ecologically important areas or these climate resilient priorities that we need people to know about, to the RPCs to then get them to the town planning commissions and select boards. So that's a huge one. And then there's one in here about the capacity and resources for the establishment of new town forests. Just that, in my opinion, is more low-hanging fruit, certainly, than the others, but just an opportunity. Those town forests offer, forest benefits and are communally owned. So those rural communities can realize some economic benefit, recreational benefits, other cultural benefits from those forests. So that's, I do have another land use section coming up. So this one I termed municipal capacity building and forgot to include supporting the towns in this slide, forgive me. But any comments or questions about these three?
Jans, it's Ben. I just note that in our conversations about tasks 4 and 5, we identified the need to support regional planning commissions so that they can assist with the capacity gaps at the small town level as a consideration for task 4 as well, but we knew you would cover it, so ditto.
Anyone else?
Well, Joe brought this up a little bit, about some governance challenges. The scale of the landscapes you're talking with, are much larger than the municipalities themselves. And I wonder if there should be a conversation about, regional governance for some of these larger areas.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. In my work, I got at that here of the idea of thinking about land use planning at a larger scale. And two things. This one came up. This first one came up in ag and ecosystems, and I wanted to reiterate here this idea of a state central planning office. We've had one in the past. We could easily revive it. That would help do some of that coordination. And then number 3 is a state land use plan. I'm sure some of you who are off camera are raising your eyebrows at this moment, but I know the history here, and I know this was struck down in 1972, just after Act 250 was established. But if we want to control pattern, we can't do it in 266 separate municipalities. There has to be something larger that we call upon that tells us what's most ecologically important. And we can't continue to rely on neighbors policing neighbors to enforce that pattern. So in my opinion, this idea of a state land use plan is critically important. We could include in that limits on development in the floodplain. So there was a lot of talk about building codes, and those building codes specific to what happens in the floodplain. The other way we could handle it is by saying in our state land use plan, we're not going to develop we're not even going to put houses in those flood hazard areas. So I think the state land use plan offers a lot of opportunity for us to control that pattern. It takes a lot of the pressure off Act 250. And just because it would be a politically incredibly heavy lift doesn't mean that we shouldn't issue it or raise that idea here. In my opinion, this is the solution that is on par with the extent of the problem. You know, if we think about the threats of climate change and how enormous they are, we need solutions that are equally big. And that's why I've included this idea of a state land use plan on that, on these recommendations. Before I go through the rest of the list, I think it's probably prudent that I just stop and hear from others on that idea.
So like I said in our group discussion, that's definitely a, you know, it'll generate a lot of discussion, but it should generate some discussion, and that's what the point of this, you know, this method is. So I also said to Jens, I don't know enough. I know enough to be dangerous. So, but we have subject matter experts on this call that, you know, if now isn't the time that you want to discuss this, we'll have time next week to really dig into where these are and how they should be worded and how we want to present these to the Climate Council.
Anyone else?
I think also recognizing that there's going to be an engagement process after our presentation on pathways to the Climate Council, and so that's really meant to be a feedback cycle where we are presenting what our recommendations are as a subcommittee, and then also identifying the other subject matter experts, stakeholders, community organizations, what industry, what have you, that we want to engage with and get feedback from, so that we can make sure that their feedback is incorporated into what is eventually finalized in the Climate Action Plan.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with the idea of statewide zoning, but I certainly agree with putting it on the list to throw it out there to the public and see what sort of reactions we get.
Yeah, I'm with Catherine. I think it's a hard sell, but I think you know that too.
Yep.
What's life without a few challenges along the way, right?
Well, maybe that'll get all the attention to some of the other things. We'll just kind of slide right under.
Some good political strategy. Yep.
So can I just ask about this in general? Are the things that we're putting in this document for discussion, or are they things that we're endorsing?
So Karen, you should look at this process as the beginning of the process and not the end of it. This bringing draft recommendations to the group for discussion is meant to generate discussion and generate what we'd like to see in there. Next week, when we meet, we're going to look at this holistically, and we may have to pare down some strategies, but we really have to group our overarching messages into pathways. What are we really trying to achieve, or what are some vision statements? I know they're not really vision statements, but what our vision statements are as a result of these strategies that are put forth to the group. And then we present to Catherine and I will present to the Climate Council, and Marion, you'll have to help me here. There is a process by which the Climate Council will make some sort of decision on what it actually ends up going forth to the public at large for more further engagement. She's nodding.
Okay.
I got it. Yes.
Thank you. Thank
I
you.
don't have more detail on the process, so I'm just nodding.
Pat has his hand up.
Erica, just to build on what you nicely said, I think in the subcommittee this morning too, they realized there's kind of two tasks in the next few weeks. One is just getting all the various task groups kind of, pathways and strategies kind of coherently into one kind of presentation to the Vermont Climate Council, which you all are really working hard on. And the other piece, just to the point raised, is getting some agreement on what those strategies are, which may include forwarding ones that you don't agree with as a group, but you want the Climate Council and the public to weigh in on. So I think, there's kind of two tasks in the next few weeks, which is both coherence and some sense of agreement from the group what you want to forward on.
Thank you. Okay, any more commentary or questions or thoughts on Jens on this point? Okay, back over to you, Jens.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, I knew this was going to be a big one, but I really feel like I needed to do it. So there are a few sort of smaller ones in here that are related. This idea of just a composite map, like just somebody needs to know, do the crosswalk of all of the different zoning codes that are out there. It's not as straightforward as it sounds, since a rural residential district in one town is going to have completely different regs than a rural residential district in another town. So it is apples and oranges, but somewhere we need to figure out what that pattern looks like under current conditions. So that's what this number 2 is. I also lifted this one from Ag and Ecosystems, and it is related to the task 4, but appropriate investment in water and wastewater. Just a note, one of the big drivers of sprawl is a lack of septic capacity in our villages and downtowns, and bonding for those are often quite difficult. I'm a bit out of my wheelhouse here, and I'm sure many of you are more up to speed on this than I. But I believe that's a critical piece for limiting sprawl. This one about Act 250 is from the Vermont Forest Partnership, and it's talking about adding a criteria to address these larger issues of pattern, add a criteria to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the fragmentation of intact forest blocks and connectivity areas. I'm sure there's a lot of discussion to have there. But adding a criteria could certainly get us to this larger forest pattern. There's one here about supporting smart growth policies and funding mechanisms to help concentrate development in settled areas. So again, boost funding for water supply and wastewater. These are really similar. This is the one from Ag and Ecosystems. This is the one from the Forest Partnership. The second from the bottom, technical assistance to municipalities to implement Act 171. There's a forest planning, that's a forest integrity bill, and there's a forest planning component, or land use planning component of that requires towns to identify forest blocks and connectors. Again, basically to identify their larger forest pattern. And so this one's just saying we need to do a little bit more technical assistance to help towns understand that and how their piece fits into this larger ecological whole. And then the last one is a unique funding source to allow towns to engage with land use planning experts to implement Act 171. So Chris, maybe that's through a municipal education grant. I don't know if you all are still doing those. Maybe that's through the municipal planning grant program, but something to really help with that land use planning piece of the Act 171 is the idea here. This is my last set of recommendations. I have one slide of that fourth bullet of the Ag and Ecosystems. But before I just show you that, any comments or questions about the last part of that list? Okay.
Well, I've got one, and it's not the last part of this. Compile the composite map of existing town. That's something that's kind of in our work plan for the next year. So, you can add it, but it's something that the state of Connecticut did, and I think it is a pretty helpful thing. It's just finding the resources to do it. I think pieces are there. It's just getting somebody to go through it all and mapping it. And then just because you do it once, I think, it's important to think how it's going to be maintained and updated over time to be useful.
So Chris, did I hear in between the words there that you would recommend that I reword this to speak to that longevity?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know. I'm just letting you know that this is on our, it's something that it's in our work plan we're going to do. It just might take a little bit of time. I don't think you need to reword anything. It's also described, I think, in that list that Catherine shared. So you may want to look through that too. I think a lot of things, we got to figure out how to crosswalk all these recommendations because I think there is a lot of overlap among the different subcommittees.
Yep, thank you. And I'll just, here are the, there are just a few from ag and ecosystems that were water related. And I just wanted to reassure you that those aquatic issues were really largely handled in task 4. They're also here. So that's why I didn't come up with a separate set of pathways related to that, because I think we've got them well covered elsewhere. So with 13 minutes left, Erica, back to you and Catherine.
Thanks, Jens, and thank you, Stephanie and Ben, for all of your work in putting together the draft strategies and starting to group them into pathways as you were thinking through this. We need to, there was some feedback that was received from the group today. What I would ask is that you update your strategies based on that feedback and send me your updated slides. Ahead of next week's meeting, we need to compile all of the recommendations that have been developed thus far so that we can display them in some way, group them in some way for our meeting next week. Next week we'll need to revisit with Joe Sagali on I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 related to recommendations around fortifying transportation infrastructure. And then we have task 1 which is refining cross-sector mitigation recommendations on refining cross-sector mitigation subcommittees recommendations on reducing greenhouse gas emissions for rural communities. That group is Ann Lawless, Davis Snedeker, and Chad Farrell. So we'll be looking to hear from you folks next week on a group of draft strategies that you would recommend that you want to present to the group. So we're going to hit transportation and greenhouse gas emissions at the local community level. And then we're going to begin our discussion around pathways.
Do we have anything yet from cross-sector mitigation that can help feed into the group who's coming up with the best practices?
They have some documents online that they presented yesterday. Chad, you might have more information, but that have all of their pathways, methods, and strategies. I could also reach out to the co-chairs and see if they could send me those documents and forward them along.
They were in the chat. I checked the website earlier and I didn't see those documents up there on cross-sector subcommittee, but I would imagine they will be posted there shortly. Let me just double check here that I don't have them.
Yeah, I haven't seen them yet, so I'll reach out to them and get those posted and then share them with the group.
Great.
Share those directly at the very end? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll send them directly.
And just to revisit where in the charge this relates to, it's related to reviewing the existing planning efforts, including local and regional land use planning, transportation planning, energy planning, operations planning, and identify opportunities to better integrate and support these efforts in service of GHG emission reductions. So it's really, it doesn't have to be, I don't think it has to be too broad. I think it's really focused on how we can recommend that at the municipal level, they can look at reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. Is there any questions about what the plan is for next week? Okay.
Erica, just a question. This is Pat. Do you have a deadline when you're hoping for people to get you and Catherine the slides from their work that you just described?
Wednesday would be great at the latest. The other thing is if folks have slides that they hope to present for next meeting, they need to be sent to Marion at least, so she can get them up on the website. I'm trying to pull up my agenda here.
We have public comment after next steps.
Thank you. Open it up for public comment.
May I offer comment?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to start by saying that the lists of pathways or strategies or whatever we call them that were presented today are really impressive, and I think go a long ways towards meeting the demands of the statute and the situation that we find ourselves in with this climate emergency. And I noticed that somebody put a link to DFR's insurance rates report, and I think that gives us one idea of what we're dealing with. I think, you know, the record-breaking heat in the Northwest is not affecting us today or right now, but I think that we need to be thinking about that too. And I think that a lot of the kinds of solutions that were being discussed today do have that broad base where they can protect us from floods. They can also help protect us from heat to the extent that we have more tree cover. They can help protect us from short-term drought, which I think some Vermonters are already facing right now. So I just want to encourage you. There was a lot of talk about whether we only forward the ideas that are feasible or whether we forward everything that we think might help and might work. And so I just want to encourage you to continue to think big, because that's the scope of the problem. And thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Ian Hitchcock.
Hello all, Ian Hitchcock, Energy and Climate Program Associate for VNRC here. Largely going to echo a lot of what Dale had to say. I'm really gratified and impressed for all the hard work that went into moving the scope of the charge of this group into the beyond human realm, thinking about the natural ecosystems that these solutions are embedded within. With climate change being a problem of rapid ecological transformation, I think thinking about how our communities are embedded within those and the degree to which conservation and other efforts that were outlined really could help is a critically important issue, particularly for this committee to be thinking about, especially because, you know, all of Vermont is rural, right? But like the areas where the landscape is the most intact and in most need of preservation, I think, is disproportionately the rural areas that are the charge of this group to focus on. And along that theme of broadening focus, I would say, I just chiming into some of the earlier conversations around, you know, well, how should this group define critical infrastructure or not? I mean, this probably won't be a surprise given some of my past comments, but I would definitely encourage this group to err on the side of broader rather than not. Just from my experience, community organizing in rural places, it's the absence of kind of social structures or clear mechanisms to funnel resources to rural places is a key limiter in terms of what those areas are able to do. And we just also add my +1 to the comments around the need to really emphasize local professional capacity in whatever forms in order to help people actually take advantage of these resources. Because in my experience, it's often rural places that are either overlooked by resources and don't neatly fit into the kind of the tidy categories of buckets that are put in place to limit who gets them and who doesn't, which I very much see and appreciate the work y'all are doing to try to ameliorate some of that in the terms of the state of Vermont in the federal context, but also just, you know, doing that kind of relationship building and trust. And I would encourage folks to think about the public outreach campaign with, you know, a good degree of humility and trying to do what we can to make this process not only result in, you know, a good set of recommendations for what the state should do, but ideally stronger and deeper relationships built where people from rural places genuinely feel like their voices are heard and they had impact on the process. And I think there's a real opportunity here that y'all are well positioned to take good advantage of.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Ben?
Well, so I remember several meetings ago, I said I was gonna chime in about the Flood Resilient Community Fund every time because I thought it was gonna become an important plank or pathway, if you will, of our group's work. And we've talked a lot in the state hazard mitigation plan and now in the development of that new program about the importance of having non-federal match. And the thing I want to reflect on is that in looking at the magnitude and scope of what Jens has presented about the overall landscape and the landscape pattern and what needs to happen in it to achieve our goals here, I think we also need to look at match sources for other federal programs, just as we need to maximize the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program opportunities by knowing where the match comes from for under-resourced community projects especially. We are going to need to maximize our use of existing federal tools like the Land and Water Conservation Fund and Forest Legacy. There are pots of money out there and we need to come up with state solutions for how we're going to make those deals happen. And the Flood Resilient Community Fund is a pathway model. In the same way, we need to think about what the pathways are for funding big vision projects that are going to protect blocks of forest habitat and upland river corridor in ways that are not imposing burdens on small communities. Jens, I thank you for the head nod.
Okay, I think we are at the end of our time. Catherine, I did a lot of talking today, so I'll open it up to you if you have any closing thoughts.
I'm just going to echo everything that people have said and put in the comments, which is that we really appreciate all the work that went into getting us to the point we were at last week and this week and really moving our charge forward. It's been really impressive. And I look forward to next week seeing those who can make it in person.
Okay, thanks everybody.